The wagon creaked as it moved across the fading trail, each wheel wobbling, as if it carried the last remnants of a life no longer wanted. The sky burned orange and red, the sun dipping low, painting everything in a firelight that did not warm her. The wind moved softly, carrying with it the whispers of all she had left behind. Home, laughter, promises that turned to dust. She sat upright on the seat, reins in her hands, though the horse knew the road better than she did. Her back straight, her face calm, though beneath that composure lived an ache too old to be spoken aloud. She was a woman who had learned the weight of silence. It clung to her like a second skin. Once, there had been a man who told her she would never walk alone, that he would build her a home with his hands, that he would love her without falter. She had believed him. For what else is a heart to do but believe when it longs for safety? Yet his heart was shallow, his promises made of straw. When she confided her truth, whispered shyly that she had never shared a bed, that no man had known her that way, he laughed. Laughed not kindly, but cruelly. His words cut deeper than a blade, leaving her with a kind of wound no one could see. After that, there was no place for her. She felt herself a stranger in her own town, in her own skin. She walked through days with her chin lifted, but inside her spirit was bruised, painted with shame that was never hers to carry. The townsfolk looked at her as though she were fragile or odd or worse, undeserving of the same gentle comforts they gave so freely to others. Yet she did not break. Her dignity remained, steady as the horse pulling her wagon westward, away from the ruins of what might have been. The man who once courted her, the handsome one, the one others admired, was little more than a hollow shell. His smile was quick, but his soul shallow. He had cared only for the image of her, not the truth of her. When he mocked her confession, it was not her innocence that was the weakness, it was his. For he could not bear the weight of real tenderness, could not stand to see someone trust him wholly. And so, it was his rejection that lit the fire beneath her feet, sending her away into unknown lands, seeking something greater than the cruelty she left behind. Her nights became long stretches of silence under the sky. By the campfire, she whispered prayers into the stars, not asking for riches or ease, but for a place where her heart might rest. The flames crackled like an old hymn, the smoke drifting up into the darkness, as though carrying her words to ears unseen. Wolves howled sometimes in the distance, coyotes yipped closer, but she was not afraid. She had already faced loneliness in its rawest form, and there is no beast in the wild half as dangerous as the sting of being unloved. Villages she passed through treated her kindly enough on the surface, but there was always that look, stranger, outsider, woman alone. Some men's eyes followed her too long, sharp with hunger, while women muttered under their breath that one who travels alone has surely done something wrong. She paid them no mind. She moved on, carrying her silence, her prayer, and her unbroken spirit. Each day, she grew more skilled at survival. She mended her wagon with her own hands, learned which rivers carried clean water, which trees gave safe shade. Yet as her body grew stronger, her soul ached in ways no muscle could mend. It was not merely food or shelter she longed for. It was belonging. It was rest. She had lived too long on the edge of survival, and what her heart yearned for was not to merely endure, but to find someone who might see her as she truly was and not turn away. One evening, as her horse staggered beneath the weight of miles, the land opened to a valley. Smoke rose from chimneys in the distance, curling soft and blue into the twilight sky. A small town rested there, pressed against the shoulders of low hills. She pulled the reins, her breath catching in her chest. She was tired, the kind of tired that seeps into bone and spirit alike. This place might offer work, perhaps a chance to earn her keep. The horse slowed, hooves sinking into the soft earth near the town's edge. She looked upon the lights in the windows, the sound of voices carrying across the air. For the first time in months, she felt the faint stir of possibility. She did not know it yet, but her path was bending toward a life she had never dared imagine, toward a man who would not see her as a burden or a curiosity, but as a soul worth holding. She climbed down from the wagon, her boots touching the earth of a place that would change her forever. The mornings in that valley carried a softness, as though the world itself woke slowly. Mist clung low in the fields, and the horses stood quiet, their breath steaming against the pale light. At dawn, he was already there, a tall figure, steady in his movements, scattering hay with a rhythm the animals seemed to know, as well as they knew the beat of their own hearts. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He moved as if each gesture had its place and its time, as if life itself could be lived without noise or boast. The land seemed to lean toward him, trusting his silence. He was not a man untouched by sorrow. Grief had shaped him, though not in the way it did most men. Where others hardened, he had softened. His face was marked not by bitterness, but by the quiet wear of endurance. He had lived years alone, enough to know that solitude does not always wound, it can temper, like fire shape steel. Yet behind his eyes was a distance, a space where memory lingered like an old song half forgotten. He did not chase women, nor boast of love. He let the days pass in work, his heart steady as the horses that pulled the plow. She first noticed him in the simplest way. At the boarding kitchen where she found work, she scrubbed dishes until her fingers ached, tended laundry until her back bent. When meals were served, she always ate last, taking only what remained. He was there sometimes, seated near the back, eating quietly, never part of the rowdy talk. It was his eyes that noticed. He saw her plate, half empty, saw her shoulders drawn tight in her modesty. Yet he said nothing. Only once did she catch him pushing a bit of bread aside on his plate, as if forgotten, and later finding it set discreetly on hers. One evening, the sky turned dark without warning. The storm swept down fast, with winds that bent the trees and rain that stung like stones. Her wagon wheel had stuck in the mud, and she found herself stranded near his barn. Lightning split the sky, throwing his shadow across the ground as he stepped out to steady her horse. He opened the barn doors without a word, guiding her wagon inside, his movements calm against the fury of the storm. Inside, where the smell of hay and warm animals filled the air, he did not crowd her. He offered space, the safety of shelter, without demand. He did not look at her too long, did not pry into her story. He simply let her be. For her, this was new. Kindness without curiosity, protection without price. The days began to fold one over another, and in their small crossings, something unspoken grew. He repaired her wagon wheel one morning, his hand steady, the sun rising golden behind him. He said nothing of it, only left the work done as if it were no more than feeding his own stock. When drunken men leered at her in the street one night, he did not fight them, nor speak harshly. He simply walked beside her, silent, his presence alone enough to scatter their jeers. He did not touch her arm, did not press his claim. He only walked her home, steady as the earth beneath her feet. Their conversations were few, often no more than a handful of words. Yet those words carried more weight than the endless talk of others. He would ask if her wagon pulled smooth now, if her work left her weary, if the bread in town was worth the coin. And she would answer softly, finding that his silence between words felt safer than most men's chatter. Slowly, she began to trust not just what he said, but what he did not say. The sound of his quiet became its own comfort, a rhythm like water over stone. Time moved gently forward until one evening, the town gathered for a dance. The music spilled into the street, fiddle sharp, boots stomping, laughter rising like smoke. She sat at the edge of the room, hands folded in her lap, watching others spin and twirl in the lantern light. She had no place among them, or so she thought. The cowboy stood for a long time in the shadows, his hat in his hands, the music swelling around him. Finally, he crossed the floor with that same slow steadiness that marked all his days. He stopped before her, hesitated as though unsure if he belonged there either, and then he offered his hand. Rough, calloused, trembling just slightly. For the first time since she had left everything behind, she felt seen, not as a burden, not as a curiosity, but as someone worthy of standing in the circle of light. She placed her hand in his, and together they stepped into the dance. The evening had settled soft across the valley, the last of the sun fading beyond the low hills. On his porch, the boards warm beneath their boots, they sat in the quiet that had grown familiar between them. A lantern flickered against the wooden beams, its glow throwing long shadows across the yard. The fields hummed with crickets, and the air carried the smell of hay, rain-soaked from the day before. She folded her hands in her lap, her heart restless though the night around her was still. She had carried the truth for so long, tucked deep where no one could wound it again. Yet beside him, with his silence that felt safer than most men's promises, she felt it rise. The words pressed against her chest, trembling, afraid of what might follow once they were spoken. Finally, with her voice quiet as the lantern flame, she said it. "I have never shared a bed." The words hung between them, fragile as glass. Her voice shook, not from shame, but from the memory of laughter, the cruel kind, the mocking tone that once turned her confession into a wound. She remembered the way others had looked at her, as though her worth were something missing, as though she were less for the innocence she carried. She waited for the same now, bracing herself for rejection once more, ready for his face to harden or his eyes to turn away. But he did not laugh. He did not reach for her either. He let the silence rest for a moment, steady and calm, as if weighing the gift of her trust. Then, with a softness that held no demand, he spoke. "Then share mine forever." The words carried no heat of desire, no hunger, only promise. A bed not as a place to be taken, but as a home, a place where loneliness would no longer be her companion. In his voice she heard no judgment, only the vow that her worth had never been diminished by her past, that she was whole and seen and enough. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she did not let them fall. She turned her face toward the fields, the moon rising pale and silver above them. In that moment, the silence between them became something deeper, no longer empty, but full. A seed planted in good soil. In the days that followed, their closeness grew not in sudden fire, but in the slow, steady way of rain soaking into earth. She found herself beside him at morning, sipping coffee while the steam rose against the chill. They tended horses together, their hands brushing in the passing of bridles, in the tying of ropes. At night they walked the fields, the stars spread endless above, their steps unhurried, their words fewer than the comfort carried in their quiet. She came to know that love did not have to be grand or loud. It could live in the simple act of being seen, of being steady, of being trusted. The town began to take notice. Whispers grew in corners of the general store, in the pews at Sunday service. Some nodded in approval, recognizing the strength in the quiet bond. Others muttered crueler things, mocking what they did not understand, suggesting that her innocence was a weakness to be shamed rather than cherished. But she found that she no longer bent beneath their eyes, because his presence beside her steadied her more than the judgment of any crowd could unsettle. Yet shadows do not remain buried. One afternoon, she saw a face she had prayed never to see again, the man who once mocked her, the one who left her carrying the weight of rejection heavy as stone. He had returned to town, his charm now weathered into bitterness, his pride bruised by the years. He saw her standing with the cowboy, and his mouth twisted with scorn. Rumors began to stir like dust in the wind. He spoke her truth not as something tender, but as a weapon, telling anyone who would listen, laughing in that same cruel way, trying to unravel what she had built. His presence was a shadow creeping back over her hard-won peace, threatening to remind her of every wound she thought she had left behind. But the cowboy remained unmoved. His silence was not weakness, it was strength. He did not meet the other man's cruelty with fists, not yet, but with the same quiet steadiness he had always carried. He did not let her walk alone in the marketplace, did not let her face the whispers without his presence at her side. Where once she might have folded inward, she now lifted her chin, the strength of his quiet love steadying her spine. It was at the next gathering in town, when the murmurs swirled heavy and the stares lingered too long, that he made his choice. Music played once again, the air warm with summer, the townsfolk gathered in their restless circles. She sat at the edge, heart pounding with the old fear of eyes upon her. But this time he did not hesitate. He crossed the floor, broad-shouldered and unhurried, and he held out his hand, not in secret, not in shadow, but in the full light of the lanterns. She took it, her fingers trembling against his calloused palm. The room quieted for a breath, the stare sharp, the whispers caught. Yet none of it mattered. For the first time, she stood in the center of the light, his hand steady around hers, his strength telling her more than words ever could. She was safe. She was chosen. She was no longer alone. The dawn broke pale and gray over the valley, the kind of morning where the mist clung to the grass, as though it could not bear to let go. Horses stamped uneasily in their pens, their ears flicking at something in the air that was heavier than weather. The sky itself seemed calm, but beneath it a storm was waiting, not made of clouds, but of men. The woman stood on the porch of the ranch house, her hands folded against her chest, the cool boards pressing against her feet. Beside her, he moved with the steadiness that was his nature, as though nothing could shake him from his rhythm. Yet even he felt it, the shift in the wind, the shadow stretching toward them. It came in the form of the man she thought she had left behind. He rode into the yard with a hard face and a harder voice, the sound of his horse's hooves cracking the silence. His eyes carried the same cruelty she remembered, sharpened now by years of bitterness. He called her name like it was a curse, loud enough for those in the town who had followed him to hear. They stood a distance off, watching, their whispers already stirring. He spat his words into the air, each one meant to shame her. He mocked her past, the truth she had once spoken in trust. He told the crowd she was unworthy, that her place was not beside a man of honor, but cast aside where no one would notice her. He demanded that she leave the cowboy, that she admit herself less than what she was. The cruelty in his voice pressed on her chest like iron, threatening to undo all the quiet peace she had begun to build. For a moment, the silence hung heavy, the crowd waiting, her breath caught like a bird in a snare. Then the cowboy stepped forward. His boots moved across the dirt with a calm that defied the storm. He placed himself between her and the man who had once wounded her, his shoulders broad, his back unyielding. But he did not reach for his fists, nor for the rifle that leaned just inside the doorway. His weapon was not steel. It was truth. His voice carried steady into the morning air, low but strong enough to still the restless murmurs. Her worth is greater than your mockery, he said. Her courage is greater than your cruelty. She has walked through fire, and she will not walk alone again. His words did not rise in anger, but in conviction, and they cut sharper than any blade. The first man sneered, his pride stung, his hand twitching near his belt as if reaching for violence. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for the strike. But the cowboy did not flinch. His calm was the kind that unnerves lesser men, the kind that comes from a heart too rooted in truth to be shaken. And in that stillness, the man's cruelty was laid bare, his weakness shining clearer than his threats. The town saw it too. Where once they had whispered against her, now they watched the way she stood behind him unbroken, and the way he spoke as though her life were not his to defend but his to honor. The whispers shifted, turning sharp not against her, but against the one who had sought to shame her. His power crumbled in the face of their silence, in the weight of their eyes. He found himself alone, his bitterness no longer a weapon but a burden. With a final curse, he turned his horse and rode from the yard, the sound of hooves fading into the distance like a storm that never broke. She stood still, the air sharp in her lungs, the mist lifting slowly as though the earth itself exhaled. The cowboy turned to her then, his hand not reaching to claim, but open, steady, waiting. And she understood in that moment that she chose him not because he had stood before another man, but because he had always seen her as whole, even when the world had tried to break her apart. That night, when the house was quiet and the lantern light glowed soft against the walls, she lay her head upon his chest for the first time. The bed beneath them was no longer a place of fear or loneliness. It was home. His heartbeat carried steady beneath her ear, and for the first time, she allowed herself to rest without guarding her soul. And the story whispered itself to its close, like an old truth passed down by firelight. In the end, love is not found in fire and fury. It is found in a quiet hand reaching across the dark, saying, "Share mine forever." Perhaps you too carry a silence you have never spoken. A truth you fear would make you less in the eyes of others. Remember this: your worth is not measured by the cruelties of men, but by the tenderness of those who see you as whole. And when love comes, may it not shout nor demand, but whisper softly of forever.